Welcome to the EFC webinar on how churches and Christian organizations can communicate more effectively. My name is Karen Stiller, and we're joined today by two Christian communications professionals. In a second, I'm going to have them introduce themselves, but first I want to encourage you who are joining us to send in your questions anytime via the chat function on the right side of your screen. We really want this webinar to be practical and helpful, and so your questions are what it's all about. So please feel free to send them in. So today we're joined by Patricia Paddey and Bill Fledderus, and I'm going to have you introduce yourselves. Patricia, please go ahead and welcome.
Hi, Karen. Thank you. Everybody, I have spent my whole life working in communications in one form or another. My background and undergrad is in television production. I worked for a mainstream TV news outlet, a news release distribution agency, as a freelance writer and television producer, and as a communications consultant. I'm currently working part-time as the Director of Communications for Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto, which is an evangelical seminary rooted in the Anglican tradition. I'm studying part-time at McMaster Divinity College towards a Master's of Theological Studies, and I'm a senior writer for Faith Today. And recently, I've begun consulting with churches on their communications needs.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bill?
Wow. Patricia, I'm so glad you're here. I'm going to just put it briefly that I'm a senior editor at Faith Today, and I am also working on the communications team at the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, which publishes Faith Today. So I do get involved with news releases, social media, and stuff like that. And then also part-time, I'm an instructor at Redeemer University College here in Ontario, where I teach journalism courses on news writing and opinion writing.
And Bill, I'm glad you're here.
And Bill, I'm going to add, you're also president of the Canadian Church Press at the moment.
Right,
I think that's
right.
Relevant too.
Yeah.
So, there you go. And you're both my friends, which is lovely for me.
Awesome.
So I'd like to start off by talking about maybe what sometimes churches and Christian organizations don't do so well with communication. So are there some common mistakes or themes that you two see that we could do better with? Patricia?
I would say the first one is just thinking that nobody's going to be interested in what they're doing. That's really where it all begins, just identifying their good stories and recognizing that they do have worthwhile information to share and stories to tell. Another one I would say is speaking internal language to an external audience. It's important to clearly define in your own mind the difference between your internal and your external audiences, and then make sure that you're talking the right language to the right people. If you want to communicate effectively, you really need to be audience focused. And, I would say in this regard, we can take a lesson from Jesus. He was a master communicator. He spoke to people in a language they understood, and he used illustrations that were meaningful to them, and we need to do the same.
Oh, and when you said that about sharing good stories, I wondered if humility got in the way sometimes, if people or churches hesitate to kind of blow their own horn or something. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I think so. I think oftentimes too, it's just a matter of being so focused on the details of what we're doing that we lose sight of the bigger picture and how what we're doing could potentially be of interest to people outside of our own immediate circles. So
yeah. Okay, Bill, how about you? You get press releases all the time in your work as Faith Today, and just generally, what do you think people do that is a mistake commonly?
I think short and sweet is really a huge plus. So people a lot of times think that they have to put in too much information. I think it's more the most valuable time you can spend is thinking about what you're going to do, not actually doing it. So discussing it with your team or whoever's involved and saying, okay, what do we have to offer that is interesting to people, or how can we frame it or think about it or present it in a way that makes it appealing? Because it's sort of like a sales job that you have to do to get anybody's attention. And so like Patricia said, you don't want to think that I have nothing to offer, but sometimes you think, oh, I've got this to offer, but how can I make it sound even more, get people's attention with it? You don't want to exaggerate or misrepresent, but you do want to say, here's how it's interesting and here's how it's relevant to you in the audience. So a lot of times that can be responding to things that are already going on in the community or in the audience, whatever's going on, or something that's in the news. If you have something that your organization or your church is working on that can be tied to something that's already popular or already an ongoing discussion, then you've got a much better chance of getting people's attention. So it requires some awareness of what people are talking about, and then being able to jump onto that a little bit.
And how do you know if you have a story worth sharing then? Like if you're having an event at your church, or if you are, hosting some discussion group about some current topic, how do you actually know if it's a story worth sharing? Because I think that can be a problem sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of having multiple voices speak into that, right? So if you're working all as an individual person all on your own, you need to test out those ideas with other people and say, well, what would you bite on, or what would you be interested in? And that's so that's really about relationships, and I think especially if you can have relationships as a church communications person or an organization communications person with someone who's a journalist or several journalists or people in the media, and that you have ongoing conversations with them, then you'll get a sense of what they're interested in, and they'll get a sense of what you have to offer. And if you have a relationship that's pre-existing, then you understand each other instead of just sort of working in this anonymous way that's somehow supposed to connect, right?
I would also add to what Bill was saying, that it's important to ask yourself the question, who is this likely to be of interest to? So if your church is planning a strawberry social, for example, that's not likely going to be of interest to a national audience, but it may very well be of interest to your local community newspaper. So it's all about thinking in terms of, who who does this concern? Who is it going to be of interest to? And then how do I, communicate best with them?
Okay, and connecting with what Bill said about current events, because as we are recording this live, the royal wedding is coming up this weekend. So, Patricia, you're at an Anglican theological college as a communications officer. Are you doing anything to kind of tap into that?
Well, interesting you should ask, Karen, because I just spent my morning actually editing a blog post on the actual solemnization of marriage that Meghan Markle and Prince Harry will be having on Saturday morning. And because that will be an Anglican ceremony, the church, or the Queen, is the head of the Anglican Church in England. And so what does that all mean to non-Anglicans? I thought that would be an interesting blog post. So I posed a series of questions to one of our wonderful profs at Wycliffe and got him to respond. And hopefully that will be posted later today. So
yeah, well, I think that's a brilliant example of using a current event and thinking, how can you be, as an organization or a church that's somewhat related, how can you tap into that interest?
Can I just add something there too?
Yeah.
It's not even current events, it's future events that are the most helpful. So if you can look ahead at a calendar and say, what's going to happen next week or whatever, and you can or even at your church, if something is going to happen, a special anniversary or something is going to happen at your church, reach out, in advance, a month ahead of time, a couple of weeks ahead of time. Don't just say, oh, the only time the journalist is going to be interested is when I give them a report after the fact. That's not true at all. If you can give them advance notice, the more advance notice you can give, the more chance you have to get their attention, and the more they can then grab hold of the story and shape it the way that they think works best for their audience.
Well, that jives perfectly with the first question/comment we've received, which is saying that this one particular denomination have always found that timeliness is an issue. Sometimes content is sent out too late to be useful. So how do you get out of that pattern of being behind something instead of in front of it?
One tool that I have found really helpful is to have a communications calendar. And I have used this in, my communications work for various clients. And I literally, at the end of every year, plot out the coming year in terms of, what events are going to be happening, what news releases I know we are going to need to be sending throughout the course of the year. If there are specific publications that I want to target, I need to be conscious of their publication deadlines and cycles, because it does, like, one common error that I have seen, which taps into what this individual has said, representing the denominational publication, is that people just don't remember that a lot of Christian publications in particular are monthly publications, or even bi-monthly. And so, sending them a notice of an event that's happening 2 weeks before it happens is going to be of no use to them whatsoever, unfortunately.
That happens all the time.
Yeah.
So another comment has been made about information being sent out too early. So is there like a magical time period in which it's best to send these announcements out?
If you're well in advance, then really what you want is a series of reminders, right, that you're sending out. So if it's in the form of a news release or just calling your local journalist or whatever it is, depending on your situation, you give them as much advance notice as possible, and then send out a few things between that point and the point that the event actually arrives. But really, it's about organization and intentionality. So it's a challenge to be organized, especially I'm thinking of a small church, right? Where you've got maybe one volunteer person that's doing it, but really the time that you spend organizing is so worthwhile. It's better to spend 5 hours being organized and planning ahead than trying to cope with an event that just happened and do something 5 hours spending on it afterwards, right? The other thing is once you send out those early advance notices or whatever, you need to have a contact for the journalist or for the writer where they can get a quick response. So have a cell phone number for a person and make sure that person will be able to answer it and respond quickly, because a lot of times, yes, like Patricia mentioned, we've got these publications that are bi-monthly, but we've also got a journalist or somebody that might phone you up that maybe has a deadline in an hour. And if they can't get a hold of you, then the story opportunity is passed.
I think sometimes, and I've seen this in some settings, we're afraid of the media, and especially this mainstream secular media. We're fearful that they're out to get us and that they're going to twist things. And how can we get over that fear? Patricia?
I have often been surprised as well, Karen, by seeing that reluctance in people to communicate with the mainstream media. And it really is, there is this, I don't know whether it's Hollywood or what, but there is this kind of prevailing thought of, that every journalist is out to do gotcha journalism, whereby they're going to, twist your words or make you look bad in their publication. And I think really our fundamental Christian principles here of doing unto others as you would have done unto you can really help alleviate that. Because if you are willing to give, I wouldn't want somebody thinking the worst of me. And so, it's important that I don't think the worst of somebody else, and that I give them the benefit of the doubt, and that I assume that that they are just trying to do their job and do it to the best of their ability. And I have found, I used to work in a large mainstream media outlet, and truly I found that 99% of the people there were dedicated and people of integrity and truly wanting to do a good job. And they see their role as being pursuing truth. So as believers, we believe in truth as well. We know the one who is the truth. So I think that just telling yourself it's okay, I don't need to be afraid, can go a long way to establishing cordial relations.
Yeah.
And the relationships part, right? Like don't just contact the journalist or whatever when you have news, but take them out for coffee or whatever, like build an actual relationship, right? So that you do learn to trust them, right? Their job is not to make you look good. Their job is to tell the truth. But if you cooperate with them and you're willing to say, yeah, there's a few warts on our church as well as some good things, that goes a long way. We don't need to be afraid to show the fact that we're not perfect, but what we need to show is the love of Christ in action in our lives and in the activities of our organizations.
It seems to me also that there's some translation work required now where, like even what you're doing, Patricia, with that blog about the royal wedding and the Anglican liturgy behind it, that sometime, we've lost a bit of cultural knowledge about the church. And I think we saw that with the Canada Summer Jobs Grant situation, where I think a lot of people were left feeling like, the church is not understood maybe properly. And so I guess I'm wondering, like even just very practically, if you were sending out a press release, could you have like 2 lines, why this matters, or, how this is important to culture in the church, like just to help a journalist, say, understand what exactly you're talking about?
I always call that the so what factor.
Okay.
That every good news release should tell who, what, where, when, why, how, but also so what. So you are literally explaining why this is important, and all it takes is a line or two. But that often gets lost, and it's an important component of any news release or trying to get the attention of the media.
And so what it helps you think about is what the audience is interested in, right? So when you're working on some kind of news release, oftentimes it's about what the organization wants to go out, right? And the so what is to say, okay, so the organization wants this to go out, but what are the audience people, what are the readers or watchers going to care, what's important to them? And that's where the so what comes in, right? So it's a reminder to say, yeah, we have this impulse, but really, it's only going to be taken up if people are interested in it. And so what are the sides of it, or what's the way into it that makes it attractive for them to look at?
Okay. I have a very big question for you now, which does flow from what we were just speaking about, from someone who's watching the webinar. Could you comment on how we as Christians can find the confidence that, for example, a Billy Graham had in communicating in the general public sphere of a democracy? So I think that's a really big question now for the Christian church in general, and with religious freedom and so on, how we speak into and how we present ourselves. So maybe I'm going to narrow that question down a bit and ask about tone in particular. So our viewer is asking about confidence. I'm going to add about tone. So where do we find our confidence, and how do we speak well in a way that people can hear us? Do you want to jump into that first, Patricia?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, Karen. And I was reminded just as I think about it, of in the earliest years of the Christian church, believers were sometimes accused of being atheists, and get this, cannibals. Cannibals, yeah. Because people knew that Christians didn't worship the pantheon of Greek and Roman gods, and they heard about their strange practice of gathering to share communion, that it involved eating and drinking the body and blood of Christ. So it's a classic case of misunderstanding and miscommunication, and Christians were persecuted for it. So in terms of having the confidence to speak into our broader culture, I'm a person, my whole life I have frankly struggled with confidence, but I think at its root it gets down to recognizing that we have good news. The gospel is the best news that the world has ever had, and it needs to be shared. And it can be shared with confidence, because we also know that in addition to it being good news, it's truth. So I think at times when we may be feeling insecure in our own selves, we need to, turn our focus onto the fact that we possess the good news, and it's good news that the world needs to hear.
Oh, thank you. Bill?
I'm thinking that real good communication and real confidence comes from compassion and comes from identification with the community. So if we have an attitude like, we're going to tell you what the truth is, and we're shaking our finger at you, that's not the kind of confidence that anyone is wanting to hear, right? But if we say, you person who has a different religion than me, or a person who lives in my community, you and I are in the same, we're together, we're in the same community together, and let me let me share what I know, and I want to also hear what you know. That kind of communication that's done with love and compassion and identification between the speaker and the listener as being having more in common than they have apart. That's winsome communication, right? Instead of lecturing or some kind of taking a position where you think you know more than the other person.
Yeah. Good. Well, let's talk about some nuts and bolts now. The other day, I was actually trying to find a pastor who had won a dinner out with a recent Faith Today contest we held. And I thought, well, I'll just find the church's website. And there was not a website. And I still can't believe it. So what is the bare minimum that a church or organization needs to have in place communication-wise? Patricia?
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, every church today should have a website, because that's where people today go to look first for information. So at bare minimum, the basics would be where you're located, how to get there, what people can expect when they arrive, what you believe, what programs or ministries you're engaged in. And then I would say, once you've got that, it's important that your website be consistently updated. So there's nothing worse than going to a website and clicking on the church calendar and seeing that it's from last year, because you realize that nobody is tending to it, so it needs to be refreshed and consistently updated. So whatever your website looks like, make sure it's something that you can maintain.
Bill?
Yeah, I'd say that's really true. I think some people, especially small churches, are a little, if they're not a tech savvy person involved in volunteer leadership, they might be hesitant. But really, you can get a free website very easily and just have a single page with the basic information, right? And so if your church doesn't have anything, don't be scared off by thinking you have to put together all that information. Yeah, that might come down the road, but just for now, do that single page of here's our name, here's our address, and here's our phone number and stuff like that. And then the other thing is, like Patricia said about keeping it up to date. I think what that is about is the turnover of responsibility in a lot of churches and small organizations, right? That but there's not continuity, or there's not a person who's in charge of it. It's sort of like, well, Joey's brother did it for a little while, and then he went away to university, and then we got this other person to do it, and then for a while nobody was doing it, and that kind of thing is easy to happen, right? So it's very important that a church designates a person, whether it's a volunteer or a paid person, to be sort of the point person for communications for the church, and then trying to keep the website up to date, or the person, when the phone call comes in from a journalist, we say, okay, we know who that has to go to. That goes to so-and-so, right?
Okay, how about social media then? So you have your website, and that's really about people finding you, but with social media, you're really stepping out. What, should churches be on, and organizations be on social media? And if so, how do they choose which ones to do?
Okay, I'll jump in here, Karen. I think that sometimes with social media, we can think that we have to do it all. And I think that with social media, sometimes less can be more. And by that, I mean, don't spread yourself too thin. Identify the audience that you want to reach, and then figure out where that audience is most likely to be hanging out on social media and focus your efforts there. Maybe a Facebook group for your church will speak effectively to your internal audience. But if your church is really outreach focused and you're trying to target millennials, then Facebook is probably not the place you want to be, because statistics indicate there are more millennials, who are on Instagram these days, for example. So perhaps Instagram is the place you want to be. So do your research, figure out, who your audience is, who you're trying to talk to, and then what's going to be the most effective way of communicating with them. And the other thing is, social media really is, remind yourself that it's social. It's not about just putting out marketing messages or ads on social media. If you want your social media to be effective, it should be about building community.
So really what's important then is that you have a person who can be available for that community, who's willing to be the social media person, right? So if your church doesn't have, or if your organization doesn't have someone, again, you need to designate someone, or if you don't have someone, you shouldn't set up a Facebook page if you don't have someone that's not going to be committed to running it and interacting with questions that come in and put things on it. So that's maybe spreading yourself too thin. But so do what you have capacity for, and make sure that it's organized so that you do have a person who can do it and who can do it consistently.
And how do you handle, like Bill, if you get a whole bunch of negative comments or nasty people on social media saying things or saying nasty comments? How do you handle that? Do you just delete them, or do you interact with them, or?
Yeah, you have to make a judgment call on that. We certainly struggle with that at times with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada and with Faith Today and with other organizations that I've been associated with. There are always trolls out there who will misuse those publicly accessible communications tools. I think a lot of people that use them frequently recognize when they're being misused. So you and are willing to sort of overlook that as not being in your control. So I don't think we need to be hyper concerned about if someone says something, ignorant on it. I think our main goal is to be the hands and feet of Christ, and maybe the voice of Christ in these kind of situations. So to be generous, kind and constructive, but we can still firmly say, we're not using our Facebook feed for this kind of conversation, person so-and-so, and so, we'd ask you to use it this way, and if they don't, then certainly you can delete them or ban them from your communications if that's necessary, and if it's interrupting other people's possible experience.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. How about personality on social media? So I've read that ideally it would sound like there was a real person behind the post, but sometimes we're kind of stiff and wooden. And I mean, I guess this is something you just sort of work out as you do it. But like Patricia, when you're doing social media for clients or something, how warm do you make the posts, or does it just depend?
Well, typically, I mean, this is something that I, like you, Karen, I have heard that, we're supposed to have a voice on social media and things like that. Typically, if I'm doing the social media posts, then the voice is my voice.
Right,
and so, I do want my voice to be one that is honoring to Christ. And so I remind myself that, what are the fruits of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. So all of those things need to be guiding my interactions on social media. Now, I don't write every social media post anymore for but so sometimes they can sound, it really depends. But getting back to what Bill was talking about in terms of the interaction there. If somebody posts a negative comment, that's where I think you want your tone to be one that sounds like there's a real person behind it. And
Okay.
in fact, I recommend to my clients that if somebody is being negative, then they respond, and they need to respond. They don't just respond in the institutional voice, but they actually sign it, so that they say their name and their role at the institution, so that what it does is it takes away that level of anonymity. And I have seen hostility actually go down as a result of that.
Oh, that's a great tip. That's very interesting. Just a reminder to people watching the webinar live, you can send in questions on the right side of your screen using the chat function. And another one we've just received is, what are some mistakes you've seen churches or evangelists do on social media? We've probably covered a bit of that.
Yeah, just to go back to tone, I think sometimes the idea of social media is that it's social, so it's casual, right? But you can be too casual as well. You know, if you have 27 exclamation marks all the time after everything you say, all right, or you say, you know, so there is finding that. The other thing that I would keep in mind is you're talking to an audience. So how does the audience speak, right? So it's not, if you think about it as one-way communication, then you're all concerned about how am I presenting myself and stuff like that. But how do they receive it, right? How do they talk? You want to use the language of your audience as much as possible, or at least somewhere between your natural language and their natural language, right? Instead of just sending something off into the void and not thinking about where it's going.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Patricia? Any goof ups you've seen?
Well, you know, Karen, I mean, I see goof ups all the time, to be honest, all the time. Like just yesterday at, you know, I saw a social media post go out that had spelling and grammatical mistakes in it on an institution. And the thing is that because of the nature of social media, it is fast and sometimes it's furious. And I think the important thing is to recognize that mistakes will happen, and when they do, you own them. You know, you don't try to deny them. You own them, and if need be, you apologize for them. You know, but yeah, that's about all I could say there.
Let's segue into crisis communication then. I mean, you hope that you will never have to send out a release or an announcement or answer questions about, you know, your pastor's fall from grace or the accountant running off with the organ director or choir director or whatever. But these things do happen. And I don't know if people have been following the Bill Hybels Willow Creek situation, watching how the Board of Elders responded. There were lots of videos, lots of releases, and actually lots of apologies. To your last point, Patricia, from the group saying maybe we didn't handle this right. So should churches and organizations have crisis communication plans in place, and what should they look like?
Well, you know, obviously a crisis just by its nature is often unpredictable, and it can be devastating. So you may not be able to anticipate a specific crisis, but you can anticipate how you will respond in the midst of one. And so, you know, whether it's allegations of financial wrongdoing or leader misconduct, or even like a devastating fire, getting the right message out to the right people through the right spokespeople is the foundation for good crisis communications. And so what you need to do is you need to ask yourself, who is going to need to be informed? What will they need to know? When will they need to know it? And what channels will you use to speak to them? So whether it's your website or picking up the telephone and calling parents in your, you know, of youth in your youth group, or using social media platforms. And then identify who your spokespeople are going to be, who are your backup spokespeople going to be, and how will you get a hold of your spokespeople in a crisis. So make sure that you've got everybody's current contact information. somebody that I have appreciated his work in this area is a Canadian public relations expert by the name of Barry Doyle, who works a lot with church groups, and he says, "Tell it all, tell it fast, and tell it accurately." And I think that's a good catchphrase to keep in mind. Tell it all, tell it fast, and tell it accurately.
Yeah, because our impulse might be to hide and cover up.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's just going to make it worse.
Okay. Phil?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The transparency is really the most important thing. So if you're planning for a crisis, one thing you can just do is get together with your team. Like I'm thinking of a small church office where maybe you got, the pastor and the admin assistant and one other person or whatever. Get together once a year and do a fire drill. Like say, okay, what if this disaster happened? How would we handle it? And talk it through with each other and play out a scenario or whatever. That's so helpful. And the whole point is so that you're organized, like Patricia said. So you've got your contact information accessible, and you know what tools you're going to use to communicate. But then also who the spokesperson will be, and then how they can be very transparent about it. So yes, this horrible thing happened, and we're working on developing a response, right? Even before you have the response, you can acknowledge that it's happened, right? And you can apologize where that's necessary, right? Wherever that's appropriate, and instead of withholding communication is a bad mistake. It's better to just say whatever it is you can say, and don't be so worried that it prevents you from communicating, because that puts you in a worse situation where people start guessing what you're hiding or not saying, right?
So the no comment thing is not a good thing to do.
Generally, that's what I would say. Yes, no comment is not a good choice.
Yeah. If somebody asks you a question and you don't know how to answer it, it's better to say, you know what, I don't know, but I will look into that and I'll get back to you. Yeah. And then make sure that you do.
Yeah.
Right. So I think this webinar has been filled with very practical, helpful information, I think. But where else can people go? Like, how does a church or an organization get trained on this? Are there resources out there? And what do you suggest?
If you don't mind me jumping in, I did some looking around on the internet because I thought that's what people would use. And so I put together a little list of URLs that are helpful for the audience. The best one I thought for basic starting is called churchjuice.com. And if you have a look there, there's a lot of things like, what is a communications plan? There you go. What makes a good church website? You can maybe see that on your screen there. It's very basic and simple and practical. And so I think someone that's starting at the beginning, that's a great place to start. And there are some others. Everyone can do their own searches online, but there's quite a bit of just free stuff available that can help you to just think through some of these things. And you can see sometimes there are examples of what other churches or what other people have put together.
Mm-hmm. There are also online webinars like this one. Obviously, there are subscription emails that you can actually, services that you can subscribe to, that they will send you emails into your inbox with tips daily or weekly or monthly. In addition to Church Juice, I would also recommend churchcommunications.com. And there's another site called prochurchtools.com, which is also very good. Some denominations offer resources, and all the way up to community college courses. If you've got a great big church and you've got somebody who's very keen to take on the role of communications for your church, taking a night school course would not be a bad idea.
Yep. Churchcommunications.com also runs several Facebook groups. So you can just join a Facebook group, and there's a whole bunch of other people who are doing the same job as you, and you can ask the dumb question and get great advice just like that, right? So
there are also some really helpful groups that you can join through LinkedIn for nonprofit communications professionals. And you don't need to be working, as a nonprofit communications professional. You can just be working, as a volunteer for your church or organization doing nonprofit communications, but they can be very helpful as well.
Yeah.
What about, like, at the base of a lot of this is writing, right? Even if it's just a short little Facebook post or a long newsletter or a media release. So let's talk about good writing for a minute. What is the basis of good writing? Bill, do you want to take that first?
I'd say keep it short is really valuable, and think about the audience focus. So many times it's really hard to unlearn, but we think, I have this message and I want to send this message out. But when we're communicating in public, we always have to start with the audience. So what do I have that the audience would find beneficial? So start with the audience, and that shapes what you write and what you say. And then keep it short and simple. The other thing sometimes is that mistake that people do is they give a long introduction before they get to their main point, whatever their main point is. And when I say keep it short, what that often means is you can't put the introduction in. You have to you start with the main point. You start at the high point, right in the middle of, the most important thing is this. And then you back up and fill in some of the background and information that the person needs in order to interpret and understand what you're talking about. But you need to start right at the most urgent bit. When we talk about, in some of my courses, we talk about, well, what is news? How do you choose what's news and what's not news? And the thing that I use in a Christian situation is the acronym SIN. Something that is significant, interesting, or new, that's news. So if you think, I have a story to tell, well, where is the sin in my story? What is significant about it? What is interesting about it? What is new for the audience that I'm aiming at? And then go from there.
Very tricky use of sin. Patricia, how about you? What's good writing?
For me, it's all about clarity. Writing is supposed to communicate. So as Bill said, you start with your audience. You think in terms of who am I writing for? And then that will shape the rest of it. So you write for clarity, not to impress. And that means simple sentences. Edit your work. I can't emphasize that enough. They say good writing is rewriting. Mm-hmm. And I have found that particularly in my own instance. If you can say something in 5 words instead of in 15 words, do it. William Zinsser, one of my favorite writing coaches, calls clutter the disease of writing. And I would say, watch out for cliches, avoid the passive tense, make sure that your language is active. So that's what I would say.
I just want to jump in there for what you were saying about editing, Patricia. Really, what we need to remember is that writing and communicating is not a one-person job. It's a team job. It always takes a team to do it well. You may be stuck doing it all by yourself in a small office somewhere, but you need to get someone else's eyes on the thing that you are working on to make sure that it's good. So whether that's your mom or whether that's whoever it is, you need to have that other set of eyes. You can't just write it yourself, edit yourself, and send it out. You need to have someone helping you with it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my mom says everything I write is great. So that's not helpful.
Can I just add one other little tip? Part of this goes back to my broadcast background, but I learned very, very early in my professional life to read everything I wrote out loud, because if it sounds good to your ear, then when people read it in their inner ear, it will sound good. It will sound right, and you will avoid having sentences that are overlong or things that are confusing. So that's just one little tip. Yeah.
So if you're panting, you need to add a comma or something.
Exactly.
Shorter sentences.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, as we wrap up, I'd like to ask you both to just leave us with a closing word of encouragement. A viewer asked a question about how we communicate in the years to come. Is there a way for us to be out of the box? So you can think about that as you make your last statement, but just a word of encouragement to the beleaguered communicators out there in the Christian world. And Bill, do you want to start?
Sure. I would say that what you're doing is really important, and that God can use it in the same way that our prayers are helped by the Holy Spirit who intercedes on our behalf. God can use the work that we're doing, however imperfect, for his purposes. So we need to trust that. Also, we need to believe in relationships. So when we're communicating, it's not sending things into the void. Our job as communicators is to get to know whoever it is, the writers, the journalists, the local news person, whoever it is, and develop a relationship with them. That's even more important than the actual press release or thing that goes out. The press release or whatever it is only successful, is more successful because there's a relationship between you and that other person. So take the time to take your local news people out for coffee and get to know them, and it will help a lot.
Thank you. Patricia?
Yeah, I would say that Christian churches and organizations have good news to share. We have good news stories to tell. And in the vein of not, putting our light under a bushel, let's share them. I think that we have seen, with Karen, I think you cited at the beginning of our time together about the Canada Summer Jobs debacle and how that indicates that there's a lot of misunderstanding in our broader culture about what Christians believe and what we're all about. And some of the blame for that has to lay on our shoulders, I think. So let's recognize that we've got good news to share, and let's share it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Patricia and Bill, for all your wisdom and spending time with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined us. You can find this recorded webinar and our previous and our future ones at the efc.ca/webinars. So thank you.
Thank you,
Karen. Bye.